Victoria Martinez pressed her back against the kitchen wall as she heard the elevator doors open. She quickly checked her watch. 6:30 in the evening. Mr. Blackstone was back from his office, which meant she had exactly 15 minutes to finish cleaning the main living area before his dinner guests arrived. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and hurried through the massive penthouse apartment. The place was bigger than most people's entire homes. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed off the glittering lights of Manhattan 40 stories below. Everything in the apartment screamed money. From the Italian marble floors to the crystal chandelier, that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Victoria had been working as Mr. Blackstone's housekeeper for 8 months now. The job paid well, better than anything else she could find, and that's all that mattered. She needed every dollar to take care of her 7-year-old daughter, Elena, and pay for her grandmother's medical bills. Richard Blackstone walked into the living room, already dressed in his expensive suit. He was the kind of man who never seemed to have a hair out of place. Everything about him was perfect and cold. He looked at Victoria the same way he might look at a piece of furniture, something useful but not worth thinking about. "The apartment better be spotless tonight," he said without looking at her. "I have very important people coming over." "Yes, sir. Everything will be ready," Victoria replied quietly, continuing to dust the bookshelf. "These are potential investors for my new company. Each one of them could write a check for $50 million without thinking twice. I don't want anything to go wrong." Victoria nodded and kept working. She had learned early on that Mr. Blackstone liked to talk about his success and his money. It made him feel important. She just stayed quiet and did her job. The truth was, Richard Blackstone had more money than he knew what to do with. His technology company had made him a billionaire before he turned 35. But money hadn't made him happy. Instead, it had made him bitter and mean. He enjoyed making other people feel small because it made him feel bigger. By 7 o'clock, the apartment was perfect. Victoria had cleaned every surface until it sparkled. She had arranged fresh flowers in the expensive vases and made sure all the cushions were fluffed just right. The dining table was set with the finest china and crystal glasses that cost more than her monthly rent. The first guests started arriving at 7:15. Victoria watched from the kitchen as they entered. These were people who owned private jets and had servants of their own. The women wore jewelry that could buy houses, and the men wore watches that cost more than cars. "Good evening, Richard," called out a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair. "This place looks amazing as always." "Thank you, Patricia. You know I only accept the best," Mr. Blackstone replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. Victoria stayed busy in the kitchen, preparing the expensive appetizers that had been delivered earlier from a fancy restaurant. She could hear the guests laughing and talking in the dining room. They were discussing business deals and vacation homes in places she had only seen in magazines. As she arranged tiny pieces of caviar on silver spoons, Victoria couldn't help but think about her own life. Just 10 years ago, she had been a different person living a completely different life. But she pushed those thoughts away. That was the past. This was her reality now. "Victoria!" Mr. Blackstone's voice cut through her thoughts. "Bring out the appetizers now." She carefully carried the silver tray into the dining room. 8 people sat around the massive table, each one looking like they belonged in a magazine. Victoria moved quietly around the table, placing the expensive food in front of each guest. "Thank you," said an older man with gray hair. He was the only one who bothered to look at her and smile. Most of the others barely noticed she was there. To them, she was invisible, just someone who served food and cleaned up messes. Victoria was used to it by now. "So, Richard," said a woman with dark hair and diamonds around her neck, "tell us more about this new project of yours." "Patricia says it could change everything." Mr. Blackstone's eyes lit up. This was what he lived for, talking about his business success and impressing people with his intelligence. "Well, as you know, artificial intelligence is the future," he began. "My new company is developing software that will replace human workers in most industries. It's going to save businesses millions of dollars." Victoria continued serving food, but she couldn't help listening. She wondered if Mr. Blackstone ever thought about all the people who would lose their jobs because of his new technology. People like her, who were just trying to make a living and take care of their families. "That sounds fascinating," said the gray-haired man. "But what about all the people who will be out of work?" Mr. Blackstone waved his hand dismissively. "Progress always requires sacrifice. The people who lose their jobs will find something else to do. That's not my problem. Victoria felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face calm. She finished serving and started to head back to the kitchen. "Victoria, wait," Mr. Blackstone called out suddenly. She stopped and turned around. "Yes, sir?" "I was just telling my guests about how I only hire the most qualified people." He looked around the table with a smug expression. "Even my household staff has to meet high standards." Victoria felt her cheeks burn, but she nodded politely. She could see where this was going. Mr. Blackstone loved to show off, especially when it made other people uncomfortable. "In fact," he continued, standing up and walking over to the massive grand piano that sat in the corner of the living room, "I believe everyone should demonstrate their talents." The piano was Mr. Blackstone's pride and joy. It was a beautiful black Steinway that he had paid $2 million for. He often bragged about it to guests, even though Victoria had never seen him play a single note. "Richard, what are you doing?" asked Patricia with a nervous laugh. "I'm going to show you all how well-rounded my staff is," he said, grinning like a cat playing with a mouse. "Victoria here is going to entertain us with her musical talents." Victoria's heart started beating faster. She could see the guests shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. They knew this was wrong, but none of them were going to speak up against their host. "Mr. Blackstone, I don't think," Victoria started to say. "Nonsense," he interrupted. "I insist. Come over here and play something for my guests. Maybe something simple that matches your background." The room fell silent except for the sound of Victoria's footsteps as she slowly walked toward the piano. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. Mr. Blackstone looked triumphant, like he had just won a game. He pulled out the piano bench and patted it. "Sit down and show us what you can do. Play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or something like that." Victoria sat down slowly and looked at the keys. Her hands were shaking, but not for the reason Mr. Blackstone thought. Victoria stared down at the black and white keys in front of her. Her hands were trembling, but she tried to steady them by placing her palms flat on her knees. The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Well, go ahead," Richard said, standing behind her with his arms crossed. His voice had that tone she knew too well, the one he used when he was enjoying someone else's discomfort. "We're all waiting to hear what you can do." She could feel 8 pairs of eyes watching her from the dining table. Some of the guests had their wine glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Others were staring down at their plates, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening, but too polite or too afraid to say anything. The older man with gray hair, the one who had thanked her earlier, cleared his throat. "Richard, maybe we should just continue with dinner." No, Thomas," Richard interrupted with a wave of his hand. "This will be fun. I'm sure Victoria here has hidden talents we don't know about." "Don't you, Victoria?" Victoria's throat felt dry. She knew she had to say something, but the words seemed stuck. "Mr. Blackstone, I really should get back to preparing the next course." "The next course can wait," he said firmly. "Right now I want you to play something. Anything. Even Happy Birthday would be fine." A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Patricia, the blonde woman, was looking at her husband with raised eyebrows as if asking him to do something. But nobody spoke up. Richard walked around to face Victoria, his back to his guests. When they couldn't see his face, his expression was even crueler than his voice. He was enjoying this. For him, this wasn't just about showing off to his friends. This was about reminding Victoria exactly where she stood in his world. "You know," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I paid $2 million for this piano." $2 million. That's probably more money than you've seen in your entire life, isn't it, Victoria? Victoria's hands clenched into fists on her knees. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed this job. Elena needed new school clothes, and her grandmother's medication was getting more expensive every month. "I'm sure it's a beautiful instrument, sir," she managed to say quietly. "Oh, it is. It's a 1925 Steinway Model D Concert Grand. Do you even know what that means?" Richard was pacing now like a performer on stage. "This piano has been played by some of the greatest musicians in the world. Famous pianists, concert halls, recording studios, and..." He paused and looked down at Victoria with a smirk. "Now I'm asking my housekeeper to play it. Isn't that funny?" Thomas, the gray-haired man, set down his wineglass with more force than necessary. "Richard, what?" "I'm just having a little fun. Victoria doesn't mind, do you, Victoria?" You want to show my friends what you can do, right? Victoria looked up at him, then glanced around at the guests. Some were staring at their plates. Others were watching with the kind of horrible fascination people have when they see a car accident happening. Nobody was going to help her. She was on her own, just like always. "What would you like me to play, sir?" she asked quietly. Richard clapped his hands together, delighted. "Oh, I don't know. Something simple. Maybe Mary Had a Little Lamb. Or how about Chopsticks? That's about the right level, don't you think?" A woman at the table, Victoria thought her name was Diana, actually gasped. "Richard, that's enough." "What?" "I'm being reasonable. I can't expect her to play Beethoven or Mozart, can I?" He laughed at his own joke. "She's a housekeeper, not a concert pianist." Victoria's hands were shaking harder now, but not from nervousness or fear. Something else was building inside her. Something that had been buried for years under bills and exhaustion and the daily struggle to survive. "Maybe she doesn't even know how to read music." Richard continued. "That's okay, Victoria. Just press some keys. Make some noise. My guests will be polite and clap anyway." The humiliation was working exactly as Richard had planned. He could see Victoria shrinking into herself, getting smaller and smaller. This was what he lived for. Moments when he could prove to everyone, including himself, that he was better than other people. What he didn't see was the change happening in Victoria's eyes. Where there had been fear and embarrassment, something else was taking over. Something that had been sleeping for a long time was starting to wake up. "I think," Victoria said slowly, "I'll play something I know." "Perfect." Richard rubbed his hands together. "Something nice and simple. We're not expecting miracles here." Patricia leaned over to her husband and whispered something in his ear. He nodded and whispered back. Other guests were having similar quiet conversations, all looking very uncomfortable with what their host was doing. Victoria placed her hands on the keys for the first time. The piano bench was adjusted perfectly for someone her height. Richard must have had it set up by professionals even though he didn't play. Her fingers found their positions naturally, like they were coming home after a long journey. "Oh, look at that," Richard said mockingly. "She actually knows where to put her hands. Maybe she took a few lessons as a kid." "How cute." Thomas stood up suddenly, throwing his napkin on the table. "Richard, this is inappropriate. You're humiliating this woman for your own entertainment." "Sit down, Thomas," Richard said without looking at him. "You're being dramatic." "Victoria and I have an understanding, don't we, Victoria? She works for me, and sometimes that means doing things outside her normal duties." Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about Elena, probably doing her homework right now at the neighbor's house. She thought about her grandmother, who always told her to be proud of who she was no matter what anyone else said. She thought about all the dreams she had put aside to take care of the people she loved. "Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly, "are you sure you want me to play?" "Of course. We're all dying to hear what you can do. Right, everyone?" Nobody answered. The room was so quiet Victoria could hear the city traffic 40 floors below. She opened her eyes and looked at the keys again. Beautiful ivory keys on an instrument that cost more than most people's houses. She had been cleaning around this piano for months, dusting it carefully, polishing it until it gleamed. She had run her fingers along its smooth surface and wondered what it would sound like. Now she was about to find out. Richard was still talking, making more jokes about housekeepers and their limited skills. His guests were looking more and more uncomfortable, but none of them had the courage to really stand up to him. Victoria tuned out his voice and thought about the music. Real music. The kind that had once filled her entire world, before life got complicated and dreams had to be put on hold. Her hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped. She knew exactly what she was going to play. "Whenever you're ready," Richard said with a grin. "Don't keep us waiting all night." Victoria's fingers touched the keys and everything changed. The first note that came from the piano was soft, almost like a whisper. It floated through the room so gently that for a moment, nobody was sure they had heard anything at all. Then came the second note and the third, building into something that made everyone at the table sit up straighter. Richard's smug smile began to fade. This wasn't Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Chopsticks. This was something else entirely. Victoria's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. Her whole body had changed. The nervous, frightened woman who had been trembling just moments before was gone. In her place sat someone who belonged at this piano, someone who understood its language perfectly. The melody that filled the room was hauntingly beautiful. It started soft and mysterious, like a story being told in the dark. Then it grew stronger, more confident, weaving through emotions that words couldn't describe. The notes seemed to dance with each other, sometimes playful, sometimes sad, sometimes so powerful they made the crystal glasses on the dining table vibrate slightly. Thomas was the first to recognize what he was hearing. His mouth fell open and he slowly set down his wine glass. "My God," he whispered. "That's Rachmaninoff." Patricia grabbed her husband's arm. "Is she really playing that? Without any sheet music?" The piece Victoria had chosen was one of the most difficult in all of classical music. Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, a composition that challenged even the world's greatest pianists. It required not just technical skill, but deep emotional understanding, and Victoria was playing it as if she had been born to do exactly this. Her hands flew across the keys, jumping from the deep bass notes on the left to the sparkling high notes on the right. The music filled every corner of the apartment, flowing out through the floor-to-ceiling windows and into the New York night. It was the kind of music that could make people cry without them understanding why. Richard stood frozen behind the piano bench, his face pale. This was not what was supposed to happen. Victoria was supposed to fumble through a children's song while his guests felt sorry for her. She was supposed to prove that she was exactly what he said she was, just a housekeeper who didn't belong in his world. Instead, she was creating something magical. The music shifted, becoming more intense. Victoria's eyes were closed now and her whole body moved with the rhythm. She swayed slightly as her hands danced across the keys, completely lost in the world she was creating. Her fingers found every note perfectly, even in the most challenging passages where the melody jumped wildly across the keyboard. Diana, one of the guests, had tears running down her cheeks. She didn't even realize she was crying. The music was so beautiful, so unexpected that it caught her completely off guard. She had been to countless concerts at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall, but she had never heard anyone play with this kind of passion. "How is this possible?" Patricia whispered to her husband, but he just shook his head. He couldn't speak. He was too busy listening to something he never expected to hear in Richard's apartment. The other guests were equally stunned. These were people who owned expensive art collections and attended the most exclusive cultural events in the city. They knew quality when they heard it, and what they were hearing now was extraordinary. Richard tried to process what was happening, but his mind couldn't make sense of it. He had hired Victoria to clean his apartment and serve food to his guests. He had checked her background. She had worked for cleaning companies and rich families for years. There was nothing in her history that suggested she could do this, but here she was, playing one of the most complex pieces of music ever written, and playing it better than many professional pianists he had heard. Her technique was flawless, but more than that, she was making the music come alive. Every note had meaning. Every phrase told part of a story. The music continued to build, reaching heights that seemed impossible for one person to create. Victoria's hands moved so fast they were almost a blur, but somehow every single note was clear and perfect. The sound coming from the $2 million piano was richer and more beautiful than Richard had ever imagined it could be. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, completely mesmerized. He had studied classical music in college and had always appreciated good piano playing. But this was something special. This wasn't just skill, this was art at its highest level. "She's incredible," he breathed. The piece entered its final section, where the music became even more dramatic and powerful. Victoria's whole body was involved now, her shoulders moving as she reached for the most distant keys, her foot working the pedals to create just the right sound. The music filled the room with such intensity that it seemed to push against the walls. Richard found himself stepping backward, almost as if the music was a physical force. He looked around at his guests and saw expressions he had never seen before. They were all completely captivated, hanging on every note. Some had their eyes closed, just listening. Others were watching Victoria's hands with amazement. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. He had planned to embarrass Victoria, to show his guests how much better he was than the people who worked for him. Instead, she was giving a performance that was making him look like a fool. The music reached its climax, with notes cascading like a waterfall from the high end of the keyboard down to the low end. Victoria's hands crossed over each other again and again, creating layers of sound that seemed impossible to believe. The melody soared above it all, proud and triumphant. And then gradually it began to wind down. The storm of notes became gentler, more reflective. The same mysterious theme from the beginning returned, but now it sounded different. It sounded like someone who had been through a great journey and was finally coming home. The last note hung in the air for what felt like forever. Victoria's hands remained on the keys even after the sound faded away. She sat perfectly still, her eyes still closed, as if she didn't want to return to the real world just yet. The silence that followed was complete. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to be breathing. Finally, Victoria opened her eyes. She looked down at her hands, then slowly turned around to face the room. She saw 8 faces staring back at her with expressions of complete shock and wonder. Richard's mouth was hanging open. All his confidence, all his smugness had disappeared. He looked like someone who had just seen something impossible. Thomas was the first to move. He started clapping slowly, his hands coming together with deliberate, respectful applause. Then Patricia joined him, then Diana, then all the others. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic until everyone at the table was on their feet, clapping and cheering. Victoria stood up from the piano bench and smoothed down her simple work dress. She looked around the room at all these wealthy, powerful people who were applauding her. The housekeeper they had barely noticed when she was serving them food. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the applause. But Richard wasn't clapping. He was still standing there staring at her like he had never seen her before. Because in a way, he hadn't. The applause slowly died down as Victoria stood beside the piano, her hands clasped in front of her. The guests were still staring at her with amazement, but now there was something else in their expressions too. Curiosity. They all had the same question written on their faces: how? Thomas was the first to speak. "That was absolutely incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I've heard that piece performed by some of the world's best pianists, but never quite like that. Where did you learn to play?" Victoria glanced nervously at Richard, who was still standing motionless behind her. His face had gone through several different expressions in the past few minutes: shock, confusion, and now something that looked almost like anger. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to figure out how he had been so completely wrong about someone. Victoria started to say, then stopped. She wasn't sure how much she should reveal. These people lived in a different world from hers, and her story might not make sense to them. Patricia leaned forward in her chair. "Please tell us. That performance was extraordinary. You must have trained for years." Diana nodded enthusiastically. "I've been going to classical concerts for 20 years, and I've never heard anyone play with that kind of emotion. It was like you were telling us a story through the music." Victoria looked around the room at all these expectant faces. These were people who could buy and sell her entire life without thinking twice about it. But right now they were looking at her with respect, maybe for the first time in her life from people like them. "I studied at Juilliard," she said quietly. The room went completely silent. Juilliard was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Only the most talented musicians even got auditions there, let alone graduated. Richard finally found his voice. "That's impossible," he said harshly. "I ran a background check on you when I hired you. There was nothing about Juilliard in your file." Victoria met his eyes steadily. "You ran a background check for housekeeping jobs and references from previous employers. You didn't ask about my education." Thomas set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair. "When did you graduate?" 12 years ago, Victoria said. "I graduated summa cum laude with a master's degree in piano performance." The number hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. 12 years ago, he had been struggling to get his first tech company off the ground. He had been proud of his college degree in computer science, but this woman had been mastering one of the most difficult art forms in the world. But how? Patricia began, then stopped herself. She realized she was about to ask a very personal question. "How did I end up cleaning houses?" Victoria finished for her. She had heard this question before, though usually not from people who had just heard her play. Life happened. She walked over to the window and looked out at the glittering lights of Manhattan. From up here, the city looked beautiful and peaceful. You couldn't see the struggle that was happening down on the street level. "After I graduated, everything seemed perfect," she began. I had already started performing with small orchestras during school. My professors said I had real potential for a solo career. I had an agent who was booking me concerts, and there was talk of a recording contract. The guests listened intently. Even Richard, despite his obvious discomfort, couldn't help but be drawn into her story. I was 24 years old, and I thought I had the world figured out. I was going to be a concert pianist. I was going to travel and perform and make music for the rest of my life. Victoria's voice was soft, but there was a sadness in it that everyone could hear. "What changed?" Diana asked gently. "My mother got sick," Victoria said simply. "Cancer. She had been supporting me through school, working 2 jobs to help pay for my lessons and travel expenses for competitions. When the doctor said she needed aggressive treatment, I couldn't let her go through it alone." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood family obligation. Many successful people had stories about choosing between their dreams and their responsibilities to the people they loved. The treatment was expensive, even with insurance. I had to cancel concerts to take care of her. My agent got frustrated and dropped me. When you're trying to build a solo career, you can't just disappear for months at a time. The classical music world is very small, and people have long memories. Richard found himself thinking about his own mother, who lived comfortably in a retirement community in Florida. He visited her twice a year and paid for her care without thinking about the cost. He had never had to choose between his career and her well-being. But surely, after she got better, Patricia began. Victoria turned away from the window. She didn't get better. The treatment helped for a while, but the cancer came back. I spent 3 years taking care of her, watching her get weaker. During that time, I picked up whatever work I could find, teaching piano lessons to kids, accompanying singers playing at weddings and parties. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning running. These people were used to success stories, tales of triumph and achievement. Victoria's story was different. It was about sacrifice and loss. When she finally passed away, I was 27 years old and completely broke. I had used up all my savings on medical bills. I hadn't performed in a major venue in years. The music world had moved on without me. Diana wiped a tear from her eye. "But couldn't you have started over? Built your career back up?" Victoria smiled sadly. "That's when I found out I was pregnant with Elena. The father wasn't interested in being part of her life, so it was just going to be me. I had to think about supporting a baby, not chasing dreams that might never happen." Richard felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. He had never thought about what it would be like, to have your whole life planned out and then watch it fall apart because of things beyond your control. "I took whatever jobs I could, find that would let me be home with Elena at night," Victoria continued. "Housekeeping paid well, and I could usually work during the day while she was at school. It wasn't what I had planned for my life, but it was honest work that let me take care of my daughter." Thomas looked at Richard with barely concealed disgust. "And this is the woman you just tried to humiliate in front of all of us." Victoria quickly stepped in. "Mr. Blackstone didn't know." "How could he?" "I don't usually tell employers about my background. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway." But Richard could see that his guests were looking at him differently now. They had watched him try to embarrass someone who had given up her dreams to take care of her family. Someone who had more talent in her little finger than he had in his entire body. "I still play," Victoria said softly. "Sometimes when I'm here alone cleaning, I practice on your piano. I hope you don't mind. I know I shouldn't have, but it's such a beautiful instrument and I miss making music so much." Richard's throat felt tight. All those times he had come home to find his apartment perfectly clean. Victoria had been filling it with music he never got to hear. She had been creating beauty in his empty, cold home while he was out making more money he didn't need. The silence stretched on until Thomas finally spoke again. "What you gave up," he said slowly, "to take care of your mother and your daughter. That takes more courage than most people will ever have." Victoria looked down at her hands, the same hands that had just created magic on Richard's expensive piano. "I don't regret it," she said. "Family comes first. Music will always be there, but the people you love won't be." Richard stared at her, finally beginning to understand exactly what kind of person he had been treating like she was beneath him. Richard stood in his living room for a long time after Victoria finished speaking. The weight of what he had done was finally hitting him. He had spent months treating this woman like she was nothing, when in reality, she had accomplished more in her 20s than most people do in their entire lives. She had sacrificed her dreams for love, and he had tried to humiliate her for his own entertainment. The silence in the room was uncomfortable, but it was a different kind of uncomfortable than before. Earlier, the guests had been embarrassed by Richard's cruelty. Now they were waiting to see what kind of man he really was. "Victoria," Richard said finally, his voice much quieter than it had been all evening. "I owe you an apology. What I did tonight was wrong, and I'm sorry." Victoria looked surprised. In all the months she had worked for him, she had never heard him apologize to anyone for anything. "You don't need to apologize, sir," she said politely. "You didn't know." "That's not an excuse," Richard replied. "I should never have tried to embarrass you in front of my guests, no matter what I thought about your background." "That was cruel and you didn't deserve it," Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's a start, Richard. But an apology isn't enough to fix what happened here tonight." Richard looked around at his guests. These were people whose respect he valued, whose approval he had been trying to win with his expensive dinner party. Instead, he had shown them exactly what kind of person he was, someone who used his power to make others feel small. "You're right," he said. "Victoria, I want to make this right. But I'm not sure how." Patricia leaned forward. "I have an idea. Richard, you're hosting that charity gala next month, aren't you? The one for the children's hospital?" "Yes, but I don't see what that has to do with—" "You always hire entertainment for those events. Usually some jazz band or classical trio. This year, why don't you ask Victoria to perform?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's eyes went wide. A charity gala with Richard's crowd would mean performing for some of the most powerful people in New York City. It could be exactly the kind of opportunity she needed to get back into the music world. "I couldn't," Victoria said quickly. "I haven't performed professionally in years, and I don't have the right clothes or—" "None of that matters," Diana interrupted. "After what we just heard tonight, I guarantee you that anyone who hears you play will be talking about it for months." Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "Diana's right. What you did tonight was extraordinary. These people at Richard's gala, they go to Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall all the time. They know quality when they hear it." Richard was quiet, thinking. The charity gala was important to him. It was one of the biggest social events he hosted each year, and it raised money for a cause he actually cared about. The entertainment had to be perfect. But as he thought about it, he realized that Victoria's performance tonight had been more moving than anything he had ever heard at his previous galas. The way she had played with such passion and skill had affected everyone in the room in a way that professional entertainment rarely did. "Would you be willing to do it?" he asked Victoria. "I mean, if you want to. I don't want to pressure you." Victoria's heart was racing. A charity gala could be the break she had been hoping for without even realizing it. But it was also terrifying. She hadn't performed for an audience of strangers in so long. I would need time to prepare," she said slowly. "And I would need to find someone to watch Elena that night." "That's not a problem," Richard said quickly. "I'll pay for whatever you need. A babysitter, a new dress, whatever." "Actually," Thomas said, "my wife runs a music management company. If Victoria's performance goes well, we might be able to help her get back into the concert circuit." Victoria felt dizzy. A few hours ago, she had been cleaning dishes and trying to avoid Richard's attention. Now these wealthy, influential people were talking about helping her restart the career she had given up years ago. "But what about my job here?" she asked. "I can't just quit. I need the steady income." Richard looked uncomfortable again. "Victoria, after tonight, I don't think I can ask you to keep cleaning my apartment. It doesn't feel right anymore." Victoria's heart sank. She needed this job. Without it, she wouldn't be able to pay her bills or take care of Elena. "However," Richard continued quickly, "I have a different proposition. My company is always hosting events and entertaining clients. What if, instead of being my housekeeper, you became my official pianist? You could perform at company events, client dinners, that sort of thing. The pay would be much better than what I'm paying you now. And it would give you regular performance experience while you work on building your solo career back up," Patricia added. Victoria looked around the room at all these people who an hour ago hadn't even noticed she existed. Now they were planning her future, offering her opportunities she hadn't dared to dream about. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you all doing this for me?" "Because," Thomas said simply, "talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. What you did tonight reminded all of us why we fell in love with music in the first place." Diana nodded. "And because what you sacrificed for your family shows the kind of person you are." The music world needs more people like you. Richard cleared his throat. There's something else. My company has a scholarship program for employees' children. Elena could apply for funding for music lessons or whatever she's interested in. I know private school can be expensive. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Patricia urged. Let us help you get back to where you belong. Over the next 2 hours, the dinner party turned into an impromptu planning session. Thomas called his wife and put her on speakerphone. When she heard about Victoria's performance, she immediately wanted to schedule a meeting. Patricia offered to help Victoria find appropriate performance attire. Diana promised to spread the word about the charity gala performance to all her friends in the arts community. Richard watched it all happen with a mixture of amazement and shame. These people were rallying around Victoria, excited to help her succeed. They were showing her the kind of kindness and respect that he should have shown her from the beginning. As the evening wound down and the guests prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Richard aside. You know, he said quietly, what happened tonight could have gone very differently. You could have continued being cruel, even after you heard her play. The fact that you're trying to make it right says something about your character. Richard shook his head. I'm just trying to fix what I broke. Maybe, Thomas replied. But I think you learned something tonight too, about judging people based on their circumstances instead of their worth. After the guests left, Victoria began clearing the dinner plates from the table. It was automatic. She'd been cleaning up after Richard's dinner parties for months. Victoria, stop, Richard said gently. You don't need to do that anymore. She looked at him uncertainly. Are you sure about all this? The job offer, the gala performance? You don't have to do any of this just because you feel guilty. Richard sat down at his dining table and looked at her seriously. I'm not doing this because I feel guilty, although I do. I'm doing this because tonight you showed me something I had forgotten. That every person has value, regardless of what job they do or how much money they make. You reminded me that there's beauty and talent and dignity in places I never thought to look. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since she had started working for him, it was a real smile. 3 months later, Victoria Martinez walked onto the stage at Carnegie Hall for her first solo recital in over 10 years. In the audience, Richard Blackstone sat in the front row applauding louder than anyone else.